Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate it. I haven't been here the whole time, but it's very exciting to hear this shift in focus towards what are the issues and facing young adults. And as Bill mentioned earlier, the military is just about all young adults. I will correct you a little bit. You say essentially all male, and of course it's 15% female, and we run the place, don't we? Okay, so what I'm going to focus on today is the effects of the what I call the Long War. It's been called many, many different things, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background and history and then talk about the big issues. And you all have heard about these: PTSD, suicide, traumatic brain injury, but just to emphasize them. I have to open with a little bit of history since Hutch gave me 2 extra minutes. I can describe 100 years in those 2 minutes. Every war produces psychological reactions. We've called it shell shock and battle fatigue. There's another theme that you see over and over again that you also alluded to, which is how we decide who should come into the service. And we have several people here, if you want to raise your hand, that are from a sessions policy. And they're the ones who help decide what pre-existing conditions should or should not be there. And over again, after every war, there's a belief, well, if we had these problems after the war, shell shock, battle fatigue, we just need to screen them harder and better, and we can keep all those problems out. Doesn't work that way. The best predictor of who will do well, as you mentioned, is somebody who gets a high school diploma, because they kind of seem to have the stick-to-itiveness and can play in the sandbox with others, but we don't yet know who is going to develop PTSD. We've tried very hard to decrease suicide by looking at risk factors. And yes, if you've had a suicide attempt, that is a risk factor, but we don't take people in who have had suicide attempts. Or at least we don't take them if they admit to it, which is of course a different issue. We also have been big believers in immediate far-forward treatment. We've used a variety of mnemonics such as PIES, treat them up on the battlefield: proximity, immediacy, expectancy of return to duty, simple methods. To remind you, PTSD was not labeled as a diagnosis until well after the end of the Vietnam War, 1980. The first Gulf War, remember that? 1990, remember Persian Gulf illnesses, which we still don't have a cause for. But one thing is that wars are environmentally dirty places. You have toxins, whether it's chemicals or down power lines. So we often see the constellation of physical problems and psychological problems after war. Operations other than war, I was in Somalia. Many of my colleagues were in Kosovo and Haiti and other places. Most of the time, the psychological burden for those now is pretty light. We use those far-forward mental health principles that we call combat stress control. And then 9/11, the beginning of the Long War. Again, another lecture, but we really use the principles of disaster psychiatry. So 9/11, 12 years, 12 very, very long years for myself in uniform, for my colleagues. Numerous deployments, and unlike other wars, World War I, World War II, where you went over for the duration, unlike Vietnam and Korea, where most people had 1 year and that was it, it's go over and back again, back and forth. Especially for the Marines. Many Marines have been deployed 5, 6, 7 times, 6, 7 months deployments. The Army, longer deployment, 2, 3 deployments. IEDs, improvised explosive device, all the battlefield stressors. When you look at ourselves, and Colonel Hutchison didn't tell you, but he was in Iraq and Tikrit, 06 to 07. I was in Iraq a few times. There's a lot of stresses on the medical staff, including taking care of the local nationals. Most of the soldiers who come through the hospitals in our facilities go on to Langstuhl or go back to duty, but there are a lot of taking care of the local population. Strong sense of support for the American people. One thing I'm jealous about Colonel Marsh back there, she still gets to wear the uniform. When I wore the uniform, any place that I went, people would come up to me and thank me. This is great. Another thing that's very important is behavioral health is front and center for the senior military leadership. And there's been lots of new programs developed. It's been a voluntary army. You no longer go join for the education. Everybody knows they're going to war. Again, repeat deployments, a large reserve component, still an elevated suicide rate. The wounded soldiers, tens of thousands of them now, traumatic brain injury, amputations. You hear a lot about the amputations. Actually, are kind of the cream of the crop. They're the ones that get all the publicity. They actually do very well with the prosthesis. What you don't hear about so much is, say, people with their faces blown off from bombs who are down at Brook in the burn unit. That's much harder to deal with. So a range of young kids, like the people in the Boston Marathon, who were very, very fit and now have these incredibly disabling injuries. Another part of that, back to the moving away from the family that we were talking about earlier, people have been out on their own for 3 years, now back dependent on their parents again, the parents that they joined the military to get away from. And now they can be totally dependent. Then when we say families, we tend to think about spouses and children, but of course a family is much larger than that. We have many teenage brothers and sisters who have lost their 21-year-old brother and they're 14. How do you make sense of that? And then the cousins, the uncles. Another dynamic that you've been hearing about all this workshop is a difficult economy, which frankly is great for the military. The moment only about a quarter of people who apply get in, but then when they get out, they're facing a very uncertain time, especially in the Guard and the Reserve. So the big psychological consequences that we're seeing, difficulties with reintegration. And that's coming back home to Fort Bragg or Fort Hood. It's getting off of active duty for those in the Reserve and Guard, coming back on, going out again. And then PTSD, depression, TBI, and suicide. And I'm going to talk about all of those in a little bit more detail. We tend to lump everything under post-traumatic stress disorder, and Congress gave us a lot of money back in 2007 on to deal with PTSD and TBI, again, TBI, traumatic brain injury, but there's a whole range of reactions to combat. And of course, it's not just combat, it's being away from home, it's seeing bad things, it's maturing, it's growing up. You know, you join the Army because the Army makes a man out of you or a woman. But so there's a range. We think about it in terms of PTSD. For medical care providers, it's also compassion fatigue or provider fatigue. You've got this with chaplains, mortuary affairs workers as well. And then there's increased risk behavior. Y'all may have seen the Washington Post article on Monday talking about the increased rate of motor vehicle accidents in combat veterans. Direct correlation between that and how many deployments. And part of it may be the way they learn to drive. You're always scanning, you're always seeing what's on that bridge, you'll go through the intersection because you don't want to get caught. Part of it may be the PTSD, the alcohol abuse that we've been hearing about today, or again, the traumatic brain injury. So what is PTSD? First of all, this diagnosis is changing next week. The DSM-5 is due out, and it's going to be released at the American Psychiatric Association. But this is what we have been doing, and I'll highlight briefly some of the changes. The traumatic experience with the intense fear, helplessness, or horror, the 3 different types of symptoms, re-experiencing numbing and physiological arousal, causing impairment, and there's a persistence of symptoms. Now, very importantly for those of us who work in the disability area at all, they are removing so-called criterion A2, the intense fear, helplessness, and horror, because the reality is if you're a well-trained soldier and you have the bomb blows up, the IED hits you, you don't sit there and freeze and go, what do I do now? You pick up your wounded buddies, you lay down suppressing fire, you move out and move on. But that doesn't mean that a month, a year later, those memories of the kid that was killed at the checkpoint don't come back to you. So it's really good that that's removed. Some things have been added, making it easier to meet the criteria, including difficulties with sleeping, some depressive difficulties, when a somatic reaction, so if you smell something that brings you back and you have the bodily fear, and some cognitive functions. The other thing is, again, these are not clean diagnosis. Mild traumatic brain injury is often combined with PTSD. My former boss, General Schoonmaker, you hear a lot about these being the signature wounds of the war. He used to talk about the blast as the signature weapon of the war, which can cause the TBI, the hearing loss when your eardrums are blown out, or any others. So let's just mention briefly traumatic brain injury. And in the beginning of the war, we really were not screening for it. Now it's being screened for, but people don't like to admit to it. The dynamic now is the military is downsizing. People want to stay in, and you want to stay deployed. A lot of the civilians don't understand it. But when you're a soldier, you like deployment, right, Hutch? Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But anyway, so people don't want to come to admit to things. But we know that TBIs, especially increased or persistent TBIs, recurrent TBIs, you're more likely to have persistent damage. Now let's talk about suicide, and I know I'm doing the once over, but that's what I've been told to do. So what we've seen, especially in the Army, which is this green bar, is the suicide rate has been going up and up and up. It used to go up higher in the theater of war. We went over to Iraq in 2007 when they were having a real problem with it, made some recommendations. It stabilized. Now most suicides happen to soldiers who have never deployed, and only a few are happening in theater. So in the Army, and I have looked at the Army suicides very extensively, you don't have psychiatric illness per se being a major risk factor for suicide. So this is different than the civilian population. Again, people are pre-screened. You do have, I got into trouble at work, I got a DWI, driving under the influence, I got a Dear Jane letter from home, or a combination of these. The other thing that has been added over time is this pain and disability. As people have been driving around in MRAPs, which is your name for your mechanized vehicle that's supposed to deflect mines, or other military vehicles as they've been climbing in and out of choppers or on the back of trucks, they develop the musculoskeletal problems, the bad backs, the twisted knees. And very often, especially in your older suicides, it's going to be a combination of what I think of as the psychological toxin, humiliation, the job loss, like I mentioned, if the DWI, plus the pain and disability. And by the way, in today's service, if you have a DWI, you're not only not going up, you're going out. So something that might seem like a minor issue to you, getting in trouble, getting non-judicial punishment, many people, that's the end of their career. And it's different from being fired from Walmart, where you can go next door and you don't have to tell them that you ever worked at Walmart. People know about it. Another thing, this used to be the third rail. Nobody wanted to talk about weapons use, and about 70% of Army suicides are committed by firearm. In the theater of war, it's usually the government-owned weapon. Back here, it's usually the soldier's personal weapon. Now people are beginning to talk about it. Okay, so what are some of the mitigating strategies for post-traumatic stress disorder? We know a lot about so-called evidence-based disorders, which include psychotherapy and medications, mainly SSRIs. There's a lot of new interesting work which is being done in the world of computers and avatars. It's called virtual reality therapy, and soldiers who won't go and see a shrink, they don't want to be near me under any conditions, but they'll go to their computer and they'll talk to the person on their other end of the computer. And then some new and promising approaches, which I'm very interested in, because really young men do not want to talk, and especially somebody they've never met, and they don't know about confidentiality, and they don't have a sense of control. But Marines are really into some of the stuff like yoga. One of my colleagues, Captain Kaufman, does acupuncture, and he talks about how they come for the needles and stay for the therapy. And then I'm very interested in service dogs. Again, another topic. This is Sergeant Zeke over in Afghanistan with his goggles and his booties. You know, I don't want to go talk to Doug over here and tell him about my mother, but I'll pat the dog and I'll take the dog for a walk, and the dog will help lubricate my interaction with Bill because the dog poops. I got to take it out of the house to get a walk. Again, a whole other subject. And then some of the mitigating factors for suicide. Now, suicide's been studied to death. There's been lots of task force reports on it. There's not a silver bullet. It's not that easy to solve, but there are some strategies, and one of the big ones that I think we need to do is really talk about the use of firearms. You go down to Fort Stewart, there's billboards everywhere saying don't drink and drive. You don't see any billboards that say don't drink and play Russian roulette. So this is Captain Kaufman doing acupuncture over at the NICO. Potentially useful areas, complementary and alternative medical treatment, TBI, avoid repeating concussions, and we've got a lot of other new interests. And then suicide. Again, it's not mental illness in the military population. It's not schizophrenia. It may be an adjustment disorder, but what are troops going? And commanders really need to recognize that when they give an Article 15 to somebody, which to them is no big deal, to the young recruit, it's like, my God, I'm being kicked out of the Army. I'm going back home. How can I ever explain this? So finally, in terms of ongoing research, we actually have gotten a lot of monies in the area of TBI and PTSD research, $300 million for research in 2007. What we're struggling to do is how can you really categorize, map the gaps, look at what's there. There's no single IRB for the Department of Defense Institutional Review Board. Each hospital has their own IRB, and so how can we make this easier? And then I'd like to see more research in some of these areas that I mentioned. Stellate ganglion block is an anesthetic procedure, therapy dogs. We've got good cross-sectional data, but we don't have good longitudinal data. And I put myself as my example here. This is me a couple days after 9/11 with Bush in the Pentagon. This is when I was OTSG. This is me now. You see my guys grow a goatee when they get out of the service. I've been growing my hair. But there's nobody who's following me or colleagues like me through time to see how we're transitioning. And there's very little on females in general. I'm actually doing a book now for Oxford on women at war, so we're trying to bridge some of those gaps. Wounded women, there's very, very little out there. So I'm going to close here because I'm out of time, but I think we've got our panel. This particular volume is free to download from the website, and it has a lot of this discussion in more detail. So thank you very much.